Welcome back to Anxious Faith. I'm James Burke. Now, when it comes to dealing with our mental health as Christians, it can sometimes feel like a bit of a tricky minefield to navigate. Our faith tells us that God is the God who provides, who is almighty and who can heal, and Jesus has made the way for us to accept his salvation. So surely that's enough, right? But what does that mean about seeing a psychologist, especially one who might not be a Christian? Is that going against our faith? Do they still have a role to play? Now, psychology can sometimes be a tricky topic, especially within the church. It can sometimes be seen as taboo, as something to be avoided, as it might not be of God. But at the same time, there are countless psychologists who have helped Christians to deal with their mental illnesses, and as a result, allowed them to deepen and grow their faith. Now, this episode, we're chatting with Chris. He's a familiar voice here at Anxious Faith. He was one of the 6 Aussies we journeyed with in season 1, and he's also shared more of his story in episode 7 of this season. We learned how he had to wrestle with whether just chasing all the answers to all of the big faith questions was what was going to help him deal with his mental health. If you haven't listened or watched that episode, really encourage you to go back and do that. Because Chris is someone who's previously studied 2 theological degrees. He's also planted and pastored a church, and now he's studying psychology. And so as someone who has sat in both camps, we're going to chat today about what psychology is from his perspective as a student, how it's helped him, and if he sees whether psychology and faith can be in conflict or harmony when it comes to dealing with our mental health. Chris, thank you so much for joining us again. It's great to have you back. Chris has been a part of season 1 of Anxious Faith. We've also had an episode previously in season 2 where you've shared some of your story and some of the experiences you've had in your life that's kind of shaped you as the person you are today and shaped your understanding of faith and gotten you to the point where you are today. So if you haven't already listened to that, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that previous episode. It'd be great for you to kind of understand who Chris is, where he comes from. But so I'd love to have a bit of a chat about, why you got to the point of, having studied a couple of theology degrees to now studying psychology, and where some of your experiences have led you to that point, kind of thing, and kind of where you're hoping to take that as you go on.
Absolutely. Well, I think you've hit on some awesome points there already, and I have to say, when I share these, I've got a couple of stories I can share, and I'll say up front, if you notice the hypocrisy, that's great. You followed along really well. Nice. Because the first story I'll share is when I'm a teenager, and the second one's from when I'm a young adult. Yep. And they don't line up very well, and you'll see why. But I've had some brilliant experiences as a result of therapy. And so I shared in the previous episode, really struggling with anger as a result of my anxiety and feeling like I didn't really have any sense of control over life. And that really escalated until my mum decided to take me to see a Christian counsellor. And it was really a bit of a mini testimony, that experience. Yeah. His name was Gary. He's such a great guy. And I only really saw him a few times. The first time I saw him, I was so angry to be there. I was angry with my mum. I called her a very rude word during the session. We didn't get anything productive done whatsoever because I just wasn't in a space to listen. And all that Gary was actually able to do at that time was pray. A few events sort of occurred in between the sessions, and by the time I saw him next, I'd actually undergone a bit of a change as a result of his prayer and his counselling.
Yeah, wow.
And for me, that was a really big part of breaking that pattern of anger. Was seeing him, and so that support from him relating to me as a teenager and speaking my language, connecting with me, praying with me. And just having an ear of someone who, because he understood the topic of alcoholism very well. Having someone who could connect with me that way was profoundly helpful, not just for understanding the struggles that my parents were going through and why they were behaving the way they were, but also how it was affecting me too. Yeah. And so while he was a Christian, it was his ability to connect with my experiences and help me understand them that then helped me to regain a sense of internal control.
Yeah.
So my experience with therapy has been profoundly positive.
Yep.
The second story I want to share though is in the midst of my master's degree. So I'm two theology degrees deep, and I'm helping lead a church. And I've come across some cognitive dissonance in myself that I, at this stage, I'm not aware of.
Yep.
And what happened was we had a youth with us that was not doing very well mentally, and our subject at Bible College at that time wanted us to go into a a crisis or an issue that was going on at church, because we were it was a very practical subject, so we were learning how to sort of work through those. Obviously, working with confidentiality and those factors too there. So the youth kid that wasn't doing very well obviously needed some external therapy, some professional help from someone who genuinely understood the situation, was able to exactly what I just said about my own therapist.
Yep.
When this was suggested to me, I responded with, "But the gospel should be enough." So I just want to be really forthright. I don't count it as much of an accomplishment to have those degrees, because that kind of dissonance still was very much there.
Wow.
It's not to say they're not valuable, of course, but just want to be really forthright about that. I, despite the benefits I experienced in therapy, I still got really influenced by this way of thinking that Jesus is enough. If you've got faith as strong as small as a mustard seed, you shouldn't need a counselor.
Yep.
And it just stands in stark contradiction to my own needs and my own life.
Your own story. Yeah.
That's right. So, I just want to, so basically to say there is that studying psychology for me has come as recognition, not that Jesus is not enough at all, but that we need help in many different ways if we are to live this life that Jesus is called to.
Yeah.
And a big part of that is our own emotional maturity. But it's also understanding ourselves better.
Yep.
It's not emotional maturity is one thing, just to have good self-awareness and awareness of others so we can love neighbor better and honor God better. But there's also just the understanding of our own humanity too, where we feel a broad spectrum of emotions, some of them more challenging than others, and that we need tools and help and connections to actually deal with those. And by doing that, we actually have give ourselves the opportunity to live a Christ-like life, because we're not pushing that stuff down and ignoring it. We become aware of our weaknesses and we can turn them into strengths, just as Paul did. So I think there's an extreme value in seeking out therapists, seeking out psychologists in the purpose, in aid of living a more Christ-like life.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I'm 100% on the same page with you. So I just want to acknowledge that, not quite biased, but that fact from the outset kind of thing. I've spent time seeing a psychologist in my life. I've spent time seeing a counsellor over even a longer period of time than I was seeing a psychologist for. And both of those people, my psychologist wasn't a Christian, yet what he was able to help me work through at that particular crisis point was huge for me in my life. And it took me from being in a place of burnout and being overwhelmed and not able to function in my role as a father and a husband, and I was starting a new job at the time and all this kind of thing, to actually then get myself back to a more stable place and able to love my family and love my kids and serve God through the work I was doing kind of thing. And that was a non-Christian that helped me get to that place. So I'm with you in that same place, but I think it's really interesting that you've had those two experiences that you shared about, one, knowing that counselling has profoundly helped me and helped me change some of the way that I'm understanding myself and even behaving, to getting to that place of going, this young person in my church doesn't need a psychologist. They just need Jesus. Have you found that kind of thinking has been there a fair bit? Is that something that has just come out of you spending so much time studying theology degrees? Is it something you've experienced in churches before?
Yeah, I think it's very strong, really, in our Christian culture, and it's understandable. Jesus is full of wisdom, and he himself lived a life that was he role modeled a flourishing life in all respects, and so there is this probably innate cognitive bias that we have as Christians to think that Jesus is the answer, and that is the best articulation of the answers that we need, is just to say that Jesus is the answer. It is funny though, because it's a bit of a joke. In Sunday school when we were little, we knew that we could just say Jesus and we would, technically be right 100% of the time. But it wasn't necessarily the answer the teacher was looking for. And it's exactly the same here. So I have noticed that and experienced and also been a part of influencing this idea that we can strip everything away except the gospel, and we'll be wholly human and flourishing. And that is a result of the influences that have been around me as a young child too. Despite having reached out to other forms of help, that I've still felt quite influenced to walk back into that worldview and try to create some kind of simplicity around how we can solve these issues that we're contending against. There has been a lot of that where and when we are just looking for answers, and perhaps that's part of it, but things like trying to find the sin. If someone's feeling depressed, like there must be some sin going on, or spiritual warfare, trying to potentially simplify complex issues in order to find some solutions, so that and it's typically we have the best interests of each other at heart. We are just trying to reduce suffering. We're trying to help people, and sometimes we're looking for ways that make sense with what we already understand. And if we've got a strong Christian background, and we've talked a lot about spiritual warfare and the power of prayer, then it's understandable that we sort of lean in that direction. Yeah. But it is, I think, maturity. As maturity comes, we start to think in both and rather than either or. And so in this case, both prayer and psychological help are fantastic ways to assist somebody in reducing their own mental suffering, so that they can flourish in all parts of their life. And I know I can share. You can share even more testimonies of. I've got one friend who had a lot of anxiety, particularly around flying in a plane. Yep. And he moved through that through prayer. It wasn't actually therapy in that particular scenario. Yeah. In my case, though, that hasn't been true. Yeah. And so I just recognize that it is very different for different people. Yeah. But that ultimately there's psychology in and of itself isn't evil or good. It's just another tool that we can utilize in order to better understand ourselves, each other, and particularly mental illness and mental wellness. Yeah.
Let's go right back to the start then for a little bit, and let's just talk a little bit about, especially someone who's studying it, like what is psychology? And this is not, I'm not expecting you to give me the answer as some expert in the field or anything like that, but you are studying that, you are, looking into this space and spending time in this space. What is psychology? And what are we talking about when we say, need to see a psychologist and that kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, when we're talking about the study of psychology, literally just studying the mind, the self, how we think, our thinking patterns, our cognitive, the way we understand, perceive, experience the world. And so we can differentiate it, say, from neurology, the study of actual brain matter and synapses and connections, and from medicine, which is the physical structure of the body itself. On a side point, all of that is integrated, really. Yep. But this, psychology in particular is really just looking at the cognitive, mind operations of a human being. Yeah. And so typically it's a lot of thinking about how we think and how those thoughts affect the way we behave or feel. And so it just becomes, a bit of a study on basically how is the self experiencing the world and thinking about the world.
Yeah. And I think perhaps that is sometimes where some of the fear comes from, is that it can involve a lot of looking at yourself and thinking about yourself and bettering yourself, where we're often trying to emulate Christ and be selfless and to put away ourselves, and especially, even as it says in the Bible, to, put off our old self and become the new creation we are in Christ. So to then be dwelling or spending all this time thinking about ourself and how we think about things, do you think that's perhaps where some of the fear or the trepidation comes from?
And I think even rightly so in some ways, because we have to ask ourselves, why are we thinking about ourselves? Because there is self-righteousness or self-obsession. But ultimately, everything we do orientates around the self, how we understand our purpose and why are we even reflecting on this in the first place. And so I would very much articulate the value of psychology as being, I want to understand myself for the purposes of living a life that aligns with God's mission for the world. And so if in the simplest of terms, to love neighbor and to love God, to love neighbor as I love myself, I need to have a really good understanding of, self. I need to know how to love myself, because the love that I pour on others is just going to be the same that I typically give to myself as well. And so where there's poor understanding of how I can actually do that, I'm going to have a similar poor understanding of how I can do that for others. as well.
You were saying before about how we can get to a place where it's not psychology or Jesus. It can be a both and rather than an either or. But shouldn't Jesus actually be enough in terms of him being the perfect sacrifice that brings our restoration with the Father? He's paid the price for our sins. He is the one in whom we find our freedom from sin. So shouldn't he be enough? And by looking for help elsewhere, are we then perhaps saying he's not enough?
It's a good question. And it's probably the biggest question too. I think there's a few ways we can sort of share a couple of answers to that.
Yeah.
And one of them is to recognize that now and not yet phenomenon that we live in. Like God's kingdom is here, but it's not fully realized. We're not living in a world that fully conforms to the image that God has created for it. We're made in the image of God. That it's not that's not there.
Yeah.
But we're not fully there yet. And so living a life to see God's kingdom on earth as in heaven is an ongoing mission to see that realized. I would say that psychology is a tool to achieve that.
Okay.
And that all good things come from God. And so psychology being one of those resources that we can draw upon in order to aid in that mission to see God's kingdom on earth as in heaven. Now, there is nuance there though, because psychology is a discipline that's developed not just by Christians, but by all kinds of people.
Yeah.
And it's going to have all kinds of ideas within it that we don't necessarily all need to agree on.
Yeah.
But I think at the end of the day, we just need to ask ourselves, what's actually aiding us in achieving the mission that God left with us in his spirit, not on our own, in his spirit to achieve on earth and for eternity too, which is to walk as Christ did and to see a planet that is just and kind, that loves neighbor, treats others as we would love to also be treated. And so big picture there, but I think psychology actually aids us in doing that. And that it certainly has been my experience in that I saw a psychologist for an entire year at once recently actually for to deal with some pretty complex suffering that I was going through. And that ultimately, and I think one of the things that was so helpful was that, and this is also on a side point, if you're looking for a psychologist, it's a really good marker that you're vibing with someone helpful for you is that at the end of each session, you feel hopeful. You leave with a sense of hope. So just put that out there. Yep. But yeah, I left every session feeling hopeful, optimistic that what I had been through wasn't going to dictate the future. And that for me meant that my faith wasn't dead and it wasn't the end, that I was going through something that I could actually grow through, not just suffer.
Yeah.
And so, I would just say psychology just represents an additional resource, another resource amongst a wide array of resources that are going to help us achieve that. And I'd also say we should think about things like medicine in this place as well, because Jesus is enough, and ultimately the resurrection of the body will do away with all ailments and sicknesses, but we're still getting colds. We're still dying of cancer. We're still suffering from a broad range of illnesses that will not be present in God's fully realized kingdom. I think we can think about psychology as a medical resource in that way as well, and that will help us sort of maintain this both and attitude to say, just remembering the big picture, we are trying to live a Christ-like life. We're looking to see God's kingdom on earth as in heaven. Those are pretty broad statements because I'm trying not to, relate to any one particular cohort of Christians, but to all of us together over the many generations since Christ. But that we have, these there are resources that are helping achieve that big picture mission that we're doing with God.
Yeah. And I think it's really helpful to go, okay, well, let's start thinking of it as like medicine. So, generally we don't have issues going to the doctor if we're really sick. We go to the hospital if we break a bone or something like that. We acknowledge and recognize that there is help and ways that science or medicine is able to help our physical selves through that. What's interesting then is because psychology becomes more about our internal or our mental or our spiritual selves almost, I think perhaps that's where some of that fear comes from, that, well, hang on, the medical is fine because it's just literally dealing with just my physical body. But if we're talking about my mind and how I think, isn't that my soul or my spirit? And should we be allowing other people to mess with that?
Yeah, we should. No. It's a great question. Again, I think I'll always say why are we doing it, and what are we hoping for?
Yeah.
If it's I think we've got nothing to fear. If we're looking to look for resources and tools to assist us in our Christ-like living, then we shouldn't be fearful of the things that help us get there.
Yeah.
Because all good things come from God. The other thing I might say too, and I hope this isn't too philosophical, but all these systems we're talking about, our biology, our psychology, our neurology, are integrated. We are a single being. And we do compartmentalize. We separate these things out because it does make it easier to understand.
Yes.
And that means that, unfortunately, we segment faith and separate it from science. And we separate faith, in this particular case, faith from our psychology or faith from our biology. But ultimately, our psychology and biology are products of God's image in us. Yeah. And so I don't think we need to be fearful. These differentiations are helpful to help us understand and engage with them. We see a doctor, not a psychologist, and vice versa, depending on the issues that we're struggling with. However, at the end of the day, these parts of ourself, whether it's our physical self and our mind, which is all physical, it's all here, are part of the system that God created us to express His image in.
Yeah. And I guess, looking at it holistically then, Jesus healed people of their physical needs, but He also didn't heal some people of their physical needs kind of thing. So it's not that Jesus is the only way, because some of those people, even that were there with Jesus, still lived their life dealing with physical issues. I don't know whether I asked you this at the start, but as someone who's been in church leadership, as someone who's studied theology, what led you to the point of going, actually, I want to sign up for another degree. I want to do more study, and psychology is what I want to study.
Personal weakness.
Just a glutton for punishment.
A glutton for punishment and knowledge. Student debt.
That's it. If you always keep studying, you never have to pay it off, right?
I mean, yeah. Yeah, but also you don't ever earn that much.
Yep.
I think for me that the reason I want to study psychology is that I want to be able to helpfully articulate how we can integrate the way we talk about our mental health and our mental wellness with the way that we practice our faith.
Okay.
It was a profound weakness for me when I was suffering or going through something really complex, new and difficult, where I had some strong emotions and I didn't have the tool set to deal with them. So I would love for my psychology study to help me, of course, better deal with those internal matters of the complexities of life and where things don't necessarily have answers and so on and so forth. But I would love also to use that as a way to serve Christians too. And so for others to feel that same permission to feel those emotions that we typically describe as bad, which are just actually part of being human. Whether that's anxiety or depression or anger, hopelessness. We use a lot of different words to talk about these feelings, but ultimately they are just a facet of being human. And so studying psychology for me has been basically an enterprise in embracing authentic humanity in all of its awesome bits, the easy fun. I love it when I feel happy and excited about life and the weather's good and I'm doing renovations on my home and basically describing my day to day where it was just lovely to drive because the weather was so nice. And then there are days where, like earlier this week, it hailed. It was so weird. But like it's just hailing and dark and things feel oppressive and overwhelming. And for me, it's just realizing that whether I'm at the top of the mountain or the valley of death, they are just describing aspects of being human. And there is no need to feel ashamed of those. They are not evidence of immaturity. They are not evidence of faithlessness. They are evidence of our humanity. And so I would love for that same permission and same freedom to experience and be human. I'd love for others to have the opportunity to feel that way too, rather than posturing how we feel we should look.
So what does that kind of holistic approach look like then in terms of living out our faith? Like if you're approaching this from the mindset of going, I want to understand how we can better integrate the way we approach our mental health with our faith, what's your end goal?
My end goal.
And I've just given you the biggest existential dread ever. You're just like, oh. Well, what would you like it to look like if you can kind of get to that place where you're able to help people understand?
Well, I think I'd share an experience I had recently, because as I've continued to think about this and experience more life and do some of the study, I've begun to develop some tools to navigate my own insecurities or my own sensitivities to anxiety or loneliness or feeling depressed. And what I found incredibly beneficial, and I think this will serve me for the rest of my life, and I'd love for others to experience this too, was that by having permission to feel feelings that are otherwise described as sinful or bad, I can actually acknowledge them quite freely. And so recently I noticed I was feeling very lonely, and I was like, oh, I can't keep doing this. Like, to be perfectly vulnerable with you, I finished work one Friday. Half an hour later, I was crying, just like, I have a whole weekend ahead of me, and I don't know who I'm going to spend it with.
Wow.
And, part of that's just being a single dude. Part of that's because I live alone, which I love, by the way. That was a choice. But it has its challenges. And so, I got to this point on the Friday. I was like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? And I now have the tools to say to myself, okay, think a little more long-term rather than just in the feeling I'm in right now. Because there are things you can do about this. And it's tempting when you're in those low places to say to yourself, and because this is all part of pursuing mental wellness, is differentiating between your cognitive distortions, which is when you're thinking thoughts that are not necessarily true, and they erode your sense of well-being. So in this case, I was thinking to myself, I'll be a burden. No one wants to necessarily spend time with me. I can't, no one can solve my loneliness. The reality is, though, they can, just by hanging out with me. And I don't necessarily even need to talk about it. And so just by thinking through that, like having some resources there to be like, okay, it's okay to feel this way. It's okay to feel a little bit depressed. It's actually okay to cry about it too. But what do you want to do about it? And so for me, that was like reaching out to the friends that I care about spending time with, end up booking out a whole weekend of fun activities.
Nice.
That has a bit of a happy ending. Sometimes it's not always that easy because people are busy. And that's totally fine. But I think it's just, for me, developing these tools, and it's a multi-step process, of the tools being knowing that it's okay to feel this way, knowing that it's okay to sort of sit in it, experience it, be able to articulate it, and then be able to do something about it too. And that could be praying. It's just basically looking for that, being able to be in a position where you're able to look for those solutions. And in a broader sense, so I've used a very specific example there, that might be, okay, I'm feeling really depressed again. I'm not sure how to get out of it this time. I'm going to go see my therapist. You've got a tool there. You've got someone who can support you. In other cases, it may simply just be having a chat with a friend, but simply being able to ask for the help because you know that you need it is a tool. Is a tool in and of itself that is just so priceless. It is a concern of mine for cultures and people who are still sitting in a place for whatever reason where they might still say, oh no, to feel angry is a sin, or to feel depressed is an evidence of sin, and are therefore in a position where they can't even talk about it without feeling ashamed, and may never talk about it. And we everyone who's listening to this, and you and I, we probably all know people that do not have the tool set to talk about their mental health. And it's just something that it's a real blessing that it's become more common to talk about. And I'd love to aid in that. And just again, the more we can feel free to just share these things, recognizing that it's just a genuine part of the way God made us. It's just part of being human. We are limited beings intellectually, even emotionally. We can't carry the whole world on our shoulders, and sometimes it feels like the whole world is on our shoulders. And so we got to reach out to others. We got to talk about it, and just that sense of feeling free to articulate that is a blessing.
I think that's a really helpful way to explain it, because like you say, it gives you the tool to know, okay, well, this is something that is part of me as a human. This is part of the human experience. We've all had periods of time in our life where we're lonely, be that whether we are single or not, whether young or old at various stages of our life kind of thing. And as part of that, we all exist on a spectrum. We all feel different things at different weights and to different extents and those kind of things. So knowing that what has helped you get there is actually, okay, psychology helped me understand myself and understand that I'm going to feel like this because this is part of the way my brain works, my mind works. But now I actually know that there are things I can do as well, physically right now that, like you say, that weekend ended happily. You had a wonderful, fun weekend. It doesn't then give that false hope of it's always going to be that way because, there's not always going to be friends that are going to go, yes, absolutely. I'm also looking for stuff to do all weekend. Let's go and hang out and have fun. For me, that echoes my experience a lot as well because having spent time with counsellors and having spent time with a psychologist when I was in a particular more difficult season of my life has helped me to understand myself better. And like you say, it's given me tools to know. So I know that sometimes when I'm feeling things, that is my brain thinking worst case scenario. Hang on. One of the tools I learned was to actually go, all right, I have a fairly logical brain. Let me do the thought experience of mapping out, will that worst case scenario actually happen? Or what are the chances of that actually happening? And that's something that, to me, in my experience, like faith alone doesn't necessarily help in that place because if I'm trapped in that way of thinking, my prayers are likely just to be, hey, God, help me out of this. Or I don't know how to get this. Or take me out of this. This is a horrible situation kind of thing. But having then learned that, okay, there is actually a way that, or learnt the greater context of my brain and how my brain works to go, okay, this is a season, this will pass, and there are things I can do to get my way out from it. What I'm interested then to hear about is how, because you talk a lot about how psychology is a tool that we can use to better understand ourselves, our mental ill health. How does that sit alongside then the tools we get from our faith in terms of living a whole life? Is there a way, or are there times where the two might contradict? Even if we're saying psychology is good, it's beneficial for us to know that kind of thing. Are there times where the tool that psychology has given me actually sits maybe a little bit in conflict with what my faith teaches me and what I should be doing there?
That is such a good question. Absolutely, yes. And I think that the thing that comes to mind straight away is that the discipline of psychology intentionally doesn't talk about the concept of sin.
Okay.
And so wrongdoing or, there is we talk about things like oppositional defiant disorder or expressions of maladaptive behaviors that are not productive to a flourishing life or, doing community with others. But this idea of sin itself is not so much talked about. Now, I continue to find the idea of sin a liberating idea. It's a funny word to use for sin, simply because it is, again, an acknowledgement of our limitations. It's an acknowledgement of our, and I say this without any sense of shame, our shortcomings, that we are not God.
Yeah.
And that we're not Jesus in the sense that we're able to live a life that's fully in obedience to God's will. Like Jesus threads the needle in ways that we could never dream. Simply him saying to God, to the Father, I don't want to drink this cup.
Yeah.
I don't want to be nailed to a cross. And that's fine. It's good to feel that way because you probably don't want to be nailed to a cross, right? But to do it anyway because it's the Father's will. Now, just threading the needle, that kind of obedience, it's just incredible. And it's not. I'm not saying that's not. This is not me going in the opposite direction, saying we can never be obedient. We're totally depraved. There's no opportunity whatsoever. But just that acknowledgement, I think that's something that faith offers that psychology in a sense doesn't. It's a bit more moral and philosophical. Okay. But I find those tools to be quite helpful because they are anchoring and grounding and contextualizing. What are we talking about when we say it means to be human, to be a son or a daughter of God?
Yep.
To be in connection with the divine, but to not be divine. To be seeking eternity, God's kingdom, but to not be there yet, and to live in that really paradoxical space of, we know kind of where we're going.
Yep.
We definitely know we're not there yet, but we know that God's here now. We don't see him.
Yeah.
And so we're operating in the midst of this highly confusing scenario that thankfully we can trust that God's good in the midst of all of it. And so I think there are some tensions there with psychology and faith. And I think in that sense, I'll probably, if we're going to make a hierarchy, faith sort of gets a bit of an upper step there in terms of those concepts around sin and righteousness and so on. But they're not exactly totally relevant to what psychology is attempting to do anyway. Yep. So there's not too much. I wouldn't say there's too much tension there, but certainly there are differences that we should be mindful of. And again, as I was saying earlier, psychology, just like Christianity has its denominations, psychology just has a huge, broad cohort and spectrum of scientists and psychologists and psychiatrists developing it. There is ongoing debate and argument about how we should articulate things, and so there's no. I think it's just we should be careful to say, like, there's no silver bullet in psychology. It's not gospel. It's just another attempt to understand ourselves, to develop tools to help people flourish.
And that's it. It's not a silver bullet. The tools that a psychologist might give you will work wonderfully for one person, and for another person will do nothing.
Yeah.
They are human as well. They are limited in what they can offer, kind of thing. But if we approach it from that mindset of, I'm going to go and see if there are things I can learn that help me better understand myself and help me better equip myself to get through my daily experience when it's difficult and when I'm suffering, then I think it puts us in a much better place to, be able to live our lives ultimately for the better and enable us to serve God more because we're more capable. I guess it's one of those things of going, hey, if you're worried about it and worried about what going and seeing a psychologist is like, you can just go into it with an open mind and go, I want to hear what they say, but I know that nothing they say can get between me and my Savior. I know there's nothing that they're going to say that is going to supplant any of those foundations that I know in my faith, that I am a child of God, that I am loved, that He's created me, that I am saved and that I am going to be with Him one day. It is purely just about learning, hey, here and now on earth, in our earthly bodies that are broken at times, there are ways that we can try and help get through those experiences that, like you say, then allows us to begin to love others more and to live out His kingdom more because we're able then to flourish and serve more. So
yeah, absolutely. And I might just add to that too, on a super practical note, that psychologists are client-centered and they bring to the table what you bring. It's probably helpful because there might be someone listening who's never been to a psychologist and now is thinking, oh, maybe I should. I have been struggling and maybe it is okay to do that. Yeah. And just on a really practical note, your psychologist, Christian or not, will respond to the topics you bring up in the worldview that you have because they're simply trying to provide tools for you to help understand your own thoughts and what does it look like to you to flourish and, in terms of your own goals. So there's no practice of, say, changing your worldview when you're seeking therapy.
They're not trying to convert you to a certain position.
Exactly.
They're trying to meet you where you're at.
They're trying to provide you with tools wherever you are already. Yeah. So, helpful to know when you're stepping into that first appointment. Yeah. And again, if you have a psychologist that doesn't do that, feel free to find another one. It should be leaving hopeful and presumably less anxious about where you are. But it does take time. But yeah.
Yeah. I think it's really encouraging that you are studying this, that it's, you're someone that has had your share of mental ill health throughout your life. You've done the hard yards and done a lot of theological study kind of thing, but have gone, hey, there is actually still benefit here in learning how we integrate these parts of our life together as humans. What I'm particularly encouraged by is the fact that it doesn't in any way diminish your faith. And in fact, from the conversations I've had with you, I see it only just helping you to understand yourself in light of the world, but also in light of the kingdom of God better. and see who you are as Chris, who has been made by God. And I think for anyone, for us to get a better sense of who we are and who our identity is, identity can often be that underlying cause for so many of these things that cause us stress and anxiety and depression and things like that. So better understanding ourselves and better understanding who we are in God as well as in the world, I think is only ever going to be a good thing. Thank you so much for sharing, kind of your experience. We're actually going to be talking to a few different psychologists, hopefully a psychiatrist as well, throughout this series, and to get some more perspective on this kind of thing. So from people that are practicing psychologists that are Christians, and talk to them again, some of the similar kind of questions, but hearing from them. What is it like as a Christian who is practicing psychology? Obviously, you're not there yet, and you may not want to be going into practicing psychology. But yeah, so if you are interested more about psychology, by all means, look out for those episodes in future. But Chris, I really appreciate you sharing your experience and what you're studying it, and where it's taking you on your journey of faith in that.
Thank you so much, James.
I love Chris's approach to psychology. It's a tool that we can use and add to our own toolbox of how we can manage our mental health. And yes, while there may be times where a psychological approach might not line up 100% with what we believe as Christians, it doesn't discount it as a means to which to better help understand who we are as people, what's going on in our heads, with the ultimate goal of being able to be more mentally healthy and thus able to live out the calling God has placed on us even better. Now, this whole topic can be hard to wrap our heads around, so we're not just going to leave it here. Next episode, we're speaking with a practicing Christian psychologist, so we'll be able to go into more depth about how the two of these can coexist. Anxious Faith is a production of Our Daily Bread Ministries. Their mission and heart is to fuel a global Bible engagement movement that helps people grow deeper in Christ. If you don't know where to start but want to spend more time in the Bible, their flagship devotional, Our Daily Bread, is a great way not just to receive the Word of God each day, but to reflect on it and hopefully respond as well. If you want to learn more, you can visit them at odb.org. You can also visit our website at anxiousfaith.org to see all the latest on our blog, including an article Chris has written called "If Jesus is Enough, Why Would I See a Psychologist?" And you'll also find links to follow us on social media and get in touch. Now, thank you to everyone who's been sharing Anxious Faith with their friends and family. It's been humbling to see our audience growing. And if you think this episode or the podcast or the website might be helpful, please continue to share it. And we'd love to hear from you as well. Drop us a comment, reach out to us on socials, or email us at anxiousfaith@odb.org or via the contact form on our website at any time. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next episode.